Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. There are three players in this talk: the street, the crowd, the protesting crowd, and the law enforcing authority, the police. My task is to narrate a city historically via these three protagonists. Our language recognizes the power of the word street. An examination of this word and its etymological migration reveals that street is indeed a playful word. The Cambridge Dictionary definition is worth considering in this context. A road in a city or town that has buildings that are usually close together along one or both sides. Unquote. A couple of associations are integral to the very lexical definition of the street. First, streets must inhabit an urban world, a city or a town, as the dictionary says. And second, streets must share boundaries with a dense assemblage of buildings along one or both sides. That is, the street by definition is three-dimensional, involving not just the surface and sidewalks, but also vertical projections for which it provides a baseline. In short, the street is urban and it refers to an ensemble of spaces, a spatial complex. The street is etymologically unique. Even its closest synonym, the road, does not necessarily convey the same social and literary connotation of the street. Roads are corridors and connecting points in space. They connect points in space. Streets, on the other hand, presuppose and result in density, congestion, conviviality, and neighborliness of urban life. In spatial practices such as urban design and planning, the street is often imagined as a stage on which public life is performed, a backdrop to activities that are designed within its boundaries. Consequently, regulations ranging from land use and zoning, restrictions on and dwelling, and traffic lights attempt to circumscribe its trajectories of use and movement. Streets, therefore, refer to a life world, an ensemble of spaces that hosts life, as it were. Streets perform a social function wherein various kinds of boundary crossings occur. Unsurprisingly, then, streets have been the object of anxieties about social intercourse and forms of collective belonging and exchange that are unpredictable but vital forces in the life of a city. Regularly, urban life unsettles the social, economic, vehicular, and hygienic functions that are assigned to the street. This is on not only, this not only creates many alternative meanings in space, it also influences urban planning. Thus, the tension between planning and practice, intended use and actual use, remains alive in the street. The messy relation of the street were increasingly scrutinized since the late 19th century by discourses of sanitation and colonial era improvement schemes, and often managed through techniques of segregation between black and white towns in colonial India. The street was evaluated through what Anthony Widler in 1978 calls a pathology of urban form, where urban processes were understood as living organisms whose ills and dysfunctionalities could be diagnosed. Unfolding in the shadow of the Enlightenment, industrialization in Europe, and colonization, reformers slash administrators of the colonial and post-colonial cities indexed the health of the city through the perceived health of the street, starting up socialist critiques of industrial capitalism by thinkers such as Friedrich Engels, as well as provided the seed for demolition drive of Baron Haussmann in Paris. Either way, it was supposed that to improve the street was to improve the city at large assuring healthy and productive urban society. The 20th century street emerged in Europe in the crucible of revolutions and insurrections that took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. In Paris, we know the revolution of 1848 thrived on strategically placed barricades in the early modern architectural layout of the city. Riots and rebellions found their home in densely populated and closely built up streets where life and labor, production and reproduction came into close interface. The authoritarian state that followed the revolutions of 1848 destroyed the early modern riotous Paris streets and replaced them with a series of intersecting and parallel avenue style streets, along with diagonal thoroughfares. Unobstructed straight lines through the closely built workers' quarters made the city spatially legible. Paris, in the hands of Baron Haussmann, became a template of authoritarian urban reform for the rest of the world. While commenting on the spatial contexts of the 1848 revolution and 1878 commune, Engels wrote in 1895, rebellions in the old style, the street fight with barricades, which up to 1848 gave elsewhere the first final decision, was a considerable extent obsolete, to a considerable extent obsolete in 1871, unquote. The revolution of 1848 exposed the spatially beleaguered state of authority in the city, which called for major avenue building initiatives. Similarly, some cities in colonial South Asia, like Delhi, Lucknow, and also underwent major recycling of urban space in the post-1857 rebellion reconstruction. According to an estimate, one-third of Delhi was demolished after the rebellion to make way for new kinds of racial segregation of space. Roads and railway lines were deliberately run through the densely populated native neighborhoods. A railway station and associated roads were positioned in such a manner so as to demarcate the native quarters from the European areas of the civil lines. Recycling is valorizing. In Calcutta, colonial authorities set up an expert-managed improvement trust in 1911, whose street schemes in the central city were deliberately run through the bastis and the streetless neighborhoods to produce a more legible and automobile-friendly urban scale, free of insurrections and riots. The central city where where this renewal took place was not yet fully motorized and small enough for someone to traverse it on foot. The whole city was still centripetal in early 20th century. All other parts had to converge in this tiny area for trade and commerce, livelihood and education. Its lanes and alleyways acquired notoriety during the Swadeshi movement for clandestine revolutionary activity. For instance, the Alipur bomb trial of 1909 revealed deep connections and that local clubs, akharas, and volunteer associations had with various underground revolutionary societies. During interrogation, several houses, boarding houses, and shops on Harrison Road, Bhavani Charan Datta Lane, Mirzapur Street, Mechua Bazar Street, Raja Dinendra Street, Grey Street, and many other localities were found to be part of an underground revolutionary network. Several police officials and informants had been trapped and killed in these lanes in the recent past. The improvement trust was to break all these established features of the insurgent city through rental reorientation of the city, class-based population dispersal, suburbanization, automobilization, and road electrification. In the interwar years, Calcutta embraced avenue-style streets with sidewalks and boulevards, massive intersections, and public parks. These new spaces, however, did not put an end to protest. They became sites of a new kind of protest politics involving large public demonstrations, mass gatherings, agitation, communal warfare, and organized encroachments of sidewalks. Nothing clandestine about this. If 19th century street prompted insurgency in a clandestine manner, the new streets of the 20th century enabled a politicized mass culture of agitation and protest and encroachment to flourish. This does not, however, mean that the new streets replaced the lanes everywhere and exhaustively. The lanes reappeared elsewhere, as Engels pointed out in his famous critique. The coexistence of wide open streets and narrow alleys resulted in a complex co-evolution. Apart from the security, military, and surveillance, the streets fulfilled three more functions. Firstly, these streets were supposed to facilitate trade and commerce and capital accumulation in and through the city by ensuring the mobility of labor, commodities, and space. Secondly, they were made to ensure better circulation of air and fluids in the city to minimize the chance of the outbreak of an epidemic. Thirdly, one of the objectives and implications of street building as a centralized public work was to claim monopoly state control over the pathways and circulation of large-scale civic utilities such as drinking water, drainage, gas, and electricity that facilitated and followed the streets and lanes to reach a destination. Thus, late 19th century street building was entangled and woven with the emergence of modern urban government, whose key objective was to facilitate and regulate motion. Between 1913 and 1947, the Improvement Trust developed parks in densely built northern Calcutta, covering an area of more than 82 acres. It also added over 47-kilometer street extensions in the inner city and the suburbs. These newfound spaces provoked and enabled people to congregate, forge alliances, and lay claim on them by walking, protesting, vending, and dwelling in them. Agitational politics, protest politics, since the Swadeshi era, flourished in the newly engineered streets and public spaces of Calcutta. In fact, one of the central aspects of agitational politics in the last 4 decades of colonial rule was to challenge the non-universal and exclusivist nature of open spaces that the British and British had created in the colonial city. In the white town of Chourangi and Dalhousie Square, many streets and parks were closed to native publics and reserved for the use of Europeans in Calcutta. It was mainly through public action on the streets, such as mass gatherings, rallies, and blockades, that Calcutta finally witnessed the emergence of more inclusive public streets and public spaces in post-colonial era. A key feature of the anti-colonial mass mobilizations in Calcutta since 1905 had been to shift the venues of public rallies and meetings from the neighborhood recesses and community halls to open public spaces such as Bidon Square, College Square, and Wellington Square, and eventually to the highly restricted British areas of the city, especially around the iconic Octagonal monument in the Maidans. During the Swadeshi era, protests were confined to the Indian areas, the native town, avoiding overt confrontation with the authority. Apart from temples, meetings were regularly held in schools and college premises. Numerous fundraising processions to aid striking press workers and clerks and to support Swadeshi enterprises connected disparate streets and neighborhoods. Strikes by press workers, tramway men, carters, and railway workers disrupted traffic on numerous occasions. Municipal sweepers also joined the protests by converting certain portions of the city, especially Ward number 1 and 2, into a massive garbage vat. The white zone of the city was breached for the first time on 22nd September 1905 when a breakaway section of students attending a meeting at the town hall entered the restricted zones of the Maidans, abused European strollers, and began pelting stones. Protest marches during Swadeshi era deliberately connected sites deemed holy in Hindu sensibilities. At times, the protest rallies would touch upon the iconic river ghats and temples. On some other occasions, marches crossed the empire's administrative district and went past the city's police headquarters at Lal Bazar. The protest sought to reclaim the city from the state authority by spilling out from the interiors of buildings and adjacent grounds to streets and Maidan, a space that carried a long history of racial segregation. Such gestures were new in the Indian context, and they opened up new conversation between urban space and nationalist politics. The tradition of street protest that the Swadeshi movement initiated became more common and robust during the non-cooperation and Khilafat agitation in 1921-22. By this time, the participation of women and school students in street demonstrations became noticeable. The striking students discovered a novel method of picketing at the entrance of examination halls. On 17th January 1921, they blocked the passageway by lying flat on the College Street sidewalks. Alternatively, the native quarters of the city also made a statement by withdrawing from the street totally on 28th of January 1921, so that the visiting Duke of Connaught would be greeted with the sight of empty street. On 16th September 1921, a monstrous, that is the colonial description, meeting of 12,000 carters took place under the presidency of Swami Vishwanand, attended by Gandhi and C.R. Das. Again on 13th November 1921, Calcutta Maidan hosted a mass meeting of police constables who were asked to quit their service and join the non-cooperation agitation. The bazaars of the city emerged as key sites of protest, picketing, and hartal at this time. In 1919, Gandhi drew on this phenomenon and nationalized hartal to oppose the Rowlatt Bill. A single date and time was fixed when the entire nation would observe a hartal simultaneously and put the circulation of commodities on hold as a mass mark of protest. By 1921, hartal had become an everyday street phenomenon in Calcutta, and thus it got integrated into the city's emerging political vernacular. By the time of the non-cooperation Khilafat agitation, the volunteer movement became ubiquitous in Calcutta, and it attracted the growing public participation of women and school children of the so-called respectable classes. In 1927, the Congress carried out a massive program to boycott the all-white Simon Commission. The Simon Go Back agitation awakened the Congress from a long slumber since the end of the non-cooperation days, especially after the devastating communal riot of 1926 in Calcutta. Around the same time, a new era of strikes began, involving the working class. Most of the strikes were organized by the communists under the Workers' and Peasant Party, WPP, and involved sustained and long-term organizational strategies. Long marches, satyagrahas, and large-scale demonstrations became routine affairs. In the agitations of the late 1920s, schoolboys, middle-class women were often seen taking a frontal position. The involvement of women and children in street demonstrations meant that police could not take recourse to its usual modes of repression in fear of enabling a sensational public discourse against the police administration. Needless to say, the coming together of people from different social groups to augment the crowd, which then took the streets in an act of protest, did not leave the carefully planned public infrastructures of the city untouched. Their collective movement through public thoroughfares adopted, manipulated, and fashioned the city to cater to various popular purposes. Throughout its colonial history, Calcutta's municipal jurisdiction was outside the organized industrial belt. In this, Calcutta was much like London and Barrackpur. The city was the center of finance, trade, and commerce, a city of circulation. Industrial production happened in factories located in Howrah, Hooghly, and 24 Parganas. Unlike Bombay, Manchester, and Kanpur, Calcutta did not have a mill-going working class residing in the inner city. Therefore, Calcutta's working class was predominantly constituted by transit and transport workers, coolies, domestic and office servants, police constables, municipal workers, shopkeepers, and street hawkers. As a result, the relationship between the working class and urban space in Calcutta evolved differently from these cities. Organizing these workers into unions required trade unionists to think beyond the shop floor and working class bastis. Most of these workers never lived in bastis. They resided instead on the streets in makeshift arrangements as pavement dwellers. For these workers, then, the streets of Calcutta literally accommodated both their workspace and dwelling place, and consequently shaped the dominant narratives of workers' lives. Some of the earliest workers' unions in Calcutta developed among transport and logistics laborers, both of whom worked and lived, squatted according to the municipal imaginations in central Calcutta markets, bastis, sidewalks, rail stations, and near the port. Unsurprisingly, streets were at the center of their organization and mobilization. This became apparent in the early 1930s around the civil disobedience movement, when one such group, the upcountry Hindu and Muslim carters, claimed the streets of northern and central Calcutta. On 9th February 1930, a group of communist trade unionists formed a Carters Union. Prominent among the leaders were Madan Mohan Barman, D.P. Golbole, Sami Viswanand, Abdul Halim, Abdul Momin, and Bankim Chandra Mukherjee. An upcountry sub-inspector of Calcutta Police was given the charge of labor officer in the new union. Between 9th and 30th March 1930, these leaders met with hundreds of carters at Halliday Park, the Central Avenue, a new park that the Improvement Trust had developed in the 1920s. They decided to start a Satyagraha against a set of new traffic rules which prohibited car traffic in northern and central Calcutta streets for some hours in the day to avoid congestion. The next day, the carters and some rickshaw pullers observed a strike at the Howrah Bridge bottleneck. About 300 Satyagrahis were persecuted at Jorabagan Police Court the following day, creating a public sensation. A large crowd gathered outside the court. In response, the carters organized a large protest on the same day. They did a very interesting thing. They untied bullocks from their carts at about noon, dismantled the wheels of the carts, and arranged them across the streets. So it's a barricade. They also unloaded carts carrying steel rails, corrugated iron, and bales of merchandise, etc., across the road to obstruct traffic. This form of protest affected traffic on Strand Road, Haddison Road, Central Avenue, Chitpur Road, and in many other adjacent streets. A report in the Bengali on 2nd April described that scene as follows. The carters, I quote, the carters crowded the streets, footpaths, and whole of Strand Road, the house tops and the balconies being not exempted. The police were busy removing the carts and cleaning the traffic, but clearing the traffic, but their attempt to do so proved abortive at times, owing to the carter having repiled up the carts on the roads. Soon after, there was a fusillade of brickbats, and the three police sergeants were injured. Unquote. The Cornwallis Street, the students in Cornwallis Street, the students and carters raised a barricade up by placing carts, municipal dustbins, and road materials. In Harrison Road, the blockade was even stronger as the carts and municipal dustbins obstructed several tramcars. Around this time, Police Commissioner Charles Taggart arrived at the Howrah Bridge bottleneck with enforcement and ordered firing. The first day's firing left several carters dead. A procession of as many as 50,000 people gathered to the carters' bodies to perform the last rites. According to a 1935 IB report that I consulted, the official communist press acclaimed the strike as the first barricade street fight with the police in India, which indeed it was. After this, in 1931 and 1932, police organized protest, etc. The space of protest expanded much further in the mid-1940s. An instance from 21 and 22 November 1945 will illustrate this expanding geography of protest in the city. On 21st November 1945, there was a nationwide call for the Congress and the Muslim League to observe the day as the INA Day, Indian National Army Day. Their objective was to bolster popular support from the unconditional release of the dismantled INA soldiers under trial. After a few lectures at a students' gathering in Wellington Square, the students decided to move towards the prohibited Dalhousie Square, the center of provincial government. The size of the procession kept increasing as it proceeded through Dharmotala Street. The city police intercepted the procession when it reached the new cinema landmark at 3 p.m. It barricaded the students from entering the prohibited area containing Bengal Government Secretariat, Legislative Buildings, High Court, and Government House. At this time, another procession came along Central Avenue to join the one at Dharmotala Street. Two processions ended up facing each other on the two sides of the police barricade, in a tense race of patience between police and the students. At about 6:45 p.m., the students attempted to break the barricade and proceed towards Dalhousie Square. The stalemate nonetheless continued. Eventually, to break the stalemate, the police fired on the assembled crowd of students, killing 2 and injuring many more. As per the Bengal government's version of events, the police were gently persuading students to hold back from occupying the prohibited zones. But efforts by police to contain the crowd present were strongly resisted, and police were subjected to stone throwing, which at times was very serious. Unquote. From the above description, we find that in Dharmotala, crowd action was influenced and directed by its outside police action. The police ran through the crowd and marked the boundaries that the crowd should not cross. The boundary was, however, fluid and mobile, subject to the trajectory of events. At one point, For instance, the police boundary split the crowd down the middle, thus establishing new barricades between two approaching groups. The crowds, meanwhile, continually improvised their movements in response to changes in police action, as both sides played on the fluidity of the boundary. Police action escalated gradually, tear gas, then lathi, then bullet, thus maintaining the grammar of a civilized and organized force. The graded escalation, however, received a discrete and discontinuous response from the crowd. In the face of onslaught, the crowd would break apart into smaller groups only to reassemble and re engage the police simultaneously from different angles. In this manner, the outside margin of the crowd interfaced with the police would become a prime mover for crowd action. The thresholds that would operate in the city center then were produced through the dynamics of this crowd police dialectic. The police restricted crowds from entering prohibited zones because they were entrusted with the enforcement of impregnable boundaries in the city. The crowds on their part pushed against these boundaries to obstruct the police's endeavor with the aim of decolonizing the prohibited zones of white privilege. This protracted negotiation on the street between the police and people continued vigorously at this time. Again, on the following evening, a large procession from Wellington Square began to move toward Dalhousie Square. It was obstructed precisely at the same place on Dharmatala Road where a skirmish had broken out on the previous day. As the encounter began to spread to other parts of the city, the police once again opened fire, this time in several places: Dharmatala Street, Rasa Road and Rajbihari Avenue intersection, Sambaja Street and Arjikar intersection. Police firing left 11 dead and 44 injured. Yet again, on 11th February 1946, student activists of the Congress and Muslim League conducted a 5,000 strong procession through various streets of Calcutta. That day, the police were prepared. They were seen parading the streets with targeted squads, tear gas squads, machine guns, and lathis. The People's Age observed that the police were out to provoke a clash, although the students maintained complete discipline and peace. As the procession approached Dalhousie Square via Clive Street, the police obstructed its passage. However, the momentum of the procession was such that the barricade got pushed back. It was at this moment that a fresh regiment of armed Gurkha police appeared. The People's Age reported. At first, the police officer approached Anando Bhattacharya, General Secretary of Bengal Provincial Students Federation, who told him that the processions demanded the right of passage peacefully. The notorious Deputy Commissioner of Police, Samsud Doha, shouted at students, "Either you go away or I will smash you." Anando retorted amidst cheers, "You can never smash us." Thereupon, 200 policemen attacked the peaceful students for nearly 1 hour, etc., etc. Nearly 3 months after the firing at Dharmatala Street on 12th February 1946, a mile-long procession comprising 1,000 people, a lakh people emerged from the same Wellington Square, followed the same route, and finally entered Dalhousie Square, the white privilege, the area of white privilege. The occasion was to protest the court-martial of the INA soldier Captain Abdul Rashid. Tracking these recurrent incidents made evident that even under colonial subjugation, people's agitation cumulatively pushed the boundary of the spaces of colonial power. At the same time, they expanded the geographic horizon of protests in the city. The high and late colonial era legacy of public protests left behind a rich repertoire of political actions and rituals for the post-colonial period. Central to this new political rationality was the idea that the people were the final arbiter of what was right and legitimate, and that for political action to make an impact, one has to stage these people on or a community in significant numbers. The moral force of a large gathering became proof of righteousness and truth. Thus, Calcutta's passage to popular sovereignty involved decolonizing the city's hitherto prohibited public spaces. The bigger the gathering, the stronger the case. With the growth of opposition forces, the political vernacular of number and performance of public anger began to emerge as a more complex force. In the post-colonial decades, regional and linguistic movements, caste agitations, ethnic separatist movements, and trade union agitations routinely used the spectacle of public violence on government property, such as setting fire to government buses, trams, train compartments, police vans, schools, hospitals, etc., to express anger. At times, an entire neighborhood would stand up against the police, destroy street furniture, and assert territorial claims over the street. Popular movements in the post-colonial decades earned the Indian metros a name in the global geography of protest. These movements also gave us a legacy of people's engagement with the state. With the universalization of popular sovereignty since the mid 20th century, street protest became the most frequently used medium of mass agitation. But this is the story of the 20th century street. The 21st century cities witness the eruption of new kinds of public emotions in the social media space that informed everyday life and collective action on the streets. For much of the 20th century, we knew about events such as crowd action via the print media and the state-controlled radio and Doordarshan. There was always a time gap between actual event, the news formation, and its consumption by the virtual public via this media. In other words, the relation between the crowd and virtual public was rather mute, as the passage of information between the street and the drawing room took time. Also, there was no steady feedback loop available for the just-in-time communication of emotions, sentiments, and opinions between the crowd in action and large public, between the concrete and the abstract. Empowered by the digital technology, the new camera has more access to the cityscape, its visual embodiments, and its noise, which can be programmed to information and be transmitted immediately to the virtual public. We have seen this during the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, the Nirbhaya protest in Delhi, the anti-CAA campaign in Indian cities, and the more recent protests in Colombo, Dhaka that led to the fall of regimes. In an age of neoliberal economy, these masses, devoid of strong concept of organization, will write the history of democracy in a new way and reclaim the streets and the sidewalks of the post-colony. In this new chapter of apparatus and subject formation, perhaps the old chronicles of solidarity, befriending, camaraderie, and barricades will appear in new way. Contemporary histories of protest in Hong Kong, Beirut, Bombay, Calcutta, Cairo, or Delhi's Singhu border offer faint sketches of the likely nature of the new chapter of street politics. If motion defines authoritarian regimes, obstructions set the terms of the and tenures of everyday democratic politics. Imagine differently, authoritarian regimes can also feel still and immobile, which democratic politics shakes up into activity. The street can occasion the move from one to the other very quickly. A heavily guarded and surveyed city square can erupt into a carnivalesque rebellion like the one we saw in Tahrir Square protest. At the same time, a pulsating protest site can swiftly be supplanted by smooth, uninterrupted traffic flows or shut down by the imposition of curfew, like the case in Shaheen Bagh in Delhi. The street then embodies the messy nature of politics itself. The street aligns with capital and authoritarian regimes, but the street is also invaluable for democratic upsurges. The street and its practices are fundamentally constitutive of the malleable substance of both authoritarian politics and democratic politics. The 21st century requires a new political vocabulary. Vocabulary is immanent in struggles. It will emerge from its lived contradictions. The 20th century's owl of Minerva that brought wisdom has flown out at dusk. The 20th century street is dead. Long live the street. Thank you.